Good morning, everybody. So we're wrapping up period 4. We only have a few more lessons, and then that's all the information that you're going to be given for AP World History. We'll have covered all the content of the class, so we're in a really, really good place. We're getting to that point where we're going to start to just begin a test review with it. Now, in period 4, there are 3 major themes. Theme 1 is global conflicts. That's basically causes and outcomes of World War I and causes and outcomes of World War II and how both wars are fought. After that, theme 2 is the Cold War and decolonization. So we spent a lot of time on that. And Cold War and decolonization is one thing because they're happening concurrently. And as we saw when we covered all that material, they're very interwoven with one another, at least in some ways. Hold on, Dr. Pepper break. But the third theme is globalization. Globalization is this process that's ongoing right now, where the world is becoming more and more interconnected than it had ever been previously, to the point that now a person gets sick in China, for example, and it becomes a global pandemic, or there's a economic problem in Greece and American stock prices decrease. What happens with one part of the world affects everyone in a deeper and a more profound way than ever before. Go back in period 1, what type of connections did we have? We had interregional connections. In period 2, we started to have global connections, but it was still on a very rudimentary scale. Periods 3, those interconnections increased with industrialization. And now in period 4, again, the world's so tightly connected in a way that it's never been before that we need to look at what's caused it, what are issues with it, and then also how does that lead to changes in the world from period 3. So the first thing we want to talk about is advances in exchange and technology after 1900. We're going to have some certain classifications. One of the things that's going to lead to increased globalization is new transportation and communication technologies. Now, we had new transportation and communication technologies in period 3, like railroads, like the telegraph. Well, that started to interconnect people more. The technologies of period 4 are going to accelerate that even more. Communication technologies like the radio, cell phones, and the internet. I played chess for 2 hours yesterday with a guy from Kazakhstan. That's incredible. You never could have had that before. That sort of global interconnection randomly between 2 people. And that's all a result of new communication technologies. Radio, cell phones, internet being the big ones, being the big ways that communication can take place, both through the masses and individually. You could also throw television in here, which I think is a really great point for doing that. Movies are going to increase communication technology. Then transportation, airplanes. Remember, the airplane is invented in period 4. It's invented in 1901 in the United States by the Wright brothers. And look at how far it's come in just 120 years or so. Jets, which are technically different than airplanes. And this next one's a big thing, and it's something that we don't think about a lot. The creation of shipping containers. You're like, shipping containers? What's the big deal about that? This technology allows us to send and receive goods globally on a massive, massive, massive scale. Think about how goods were exchanged in period one, mostly on the back of a camel. Now, because one ship can carry so much goods, transportation prices are incredibly cheap. We said in period one and two, the only goods that could be exchanged long distances were um, were luxury goods, goods that were very, very, very valuable because it would take months and months and months. Now we trade very, very, very fundamentally basic things, long distances, because transportation is so cheap. And one of the reasons for that is these shipping containers. So cheap transportation, both for people and for the goods that we move, are going to allow goods to be cheaper, more accessible to more people, which is all going to contribute to this culture of consuming that we have today. One of the themes of the 20th century is fewer people are living in poverty than have ever lived as a percentage of the world's population ever before. And this is part of the reason why, because of how cheap it is and easy it is, not just to produce goods using industrialization, but to transfer goods based on these communication and transportation breakthroughs. Energy technologies are going to massively increase the amount of energy available to humans, which is going to lead to a mass production of material goods. Now, later on, we will argue the environmental cost of using these energy technologies. But in period two, we said, hey, oil is used for the first time, electricity is used for the first time. Now we're in the age of nuclear power and nuclear power plants, where these power plants using nuclear energy can produce such an enormous amount of energy to create electricity from these huge, huge, huge urban areas. We have cities in the world today that have over 20 million people in them. These energy technologies, these production technologies, these transportation and communication technologies are what makes it possible. Now, how do we feed New York? We feed it from Kansas and from Ohio and from Nebraska. And we have the ability to make food cheap and send it cheap. Nuclear energy is going to help food production. It's going to help energy production. It's going to help material production. And it's going to transform the way, the amount of energy that humans have at their disposal, both for good and for bad causes. For example, when we talked about this collapse of the Soviet Union, we talked about the Chernobyl disaster, where a nuclear power plant melted down, and there's been an environmental cost in what is the former Soviet Union, which is now in the Ukraine, ever since then. Japan had a nuclear a nuclear plant melt down within the last 10 years. That was just an incredible disaster that they are still dealing with. And I'm going to show you some of that story later on in this class. So the whole point is that these, you know, there's a huge benefit, but there's also environmental danger associated with these. And we all know the danger of petroleum and the widespread use of petroleum, the effect that's having on the environment and global warming. Green Revolution. One of the themes of world history in period four is a massively accelerated population. One of our themes throughout this class is population growth is always associated with production of food. So what has happened is in the 20th century, the world is producing exponentially more food. Now, new transportation technologies, industrial technologies, all of those have a role to play in more food production. But arguably the most important thing that's resulted in more food production is the Green Revolution. We talked about the Green Revolution when we talked about the Indian history. The Green Revolution was started by an American scientist, and it is the process of growing food using chemically and genetically modified forms in commercial agriculture. And when you start to use genetically modified seeds and chemicals and pesticides that have been worked on now for 50 years, what's going to happen is food production, especially in poorer regions of the world, is going to dramatically increase, leading to much, 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 much more food. This right here is the chart of food production in India from 1960 to 1987. And I mean, this is 30 years ago. And you can see how much the food production in India grew in just the first 30 years of adopting this. This right here is in the middle of a famine in India where millions and millions of people did not have enough food. And between 1966 and 1987, 20 years, Indian food production more than doubled. That's just one region. And the same thing is going to happen in Mexico. And the same thing is going to happen in other industrialized and post-industrial regions. And even in America, we're using green revolution technologies right now to massively, massively, massively increase the amount of food that we can produce, which is going to lead to population. And all this food we produce is great, but it's not going to have an influence unless we can get it to people. Why can we get it to people? Because of the transportation technologies we just talked about. Jets, airplanes, trains, these massive ships, and the shipping containers to be able to send it. It's all interconnected. Also, part of globalization is an American scientist creates it, and now the food production of India more than doubles. That's part of this interconnectedness of the world that we're trying to talk about and get you to see it as occurring in a way that's never happened before in world history. Birth control is going to radically change. Some people argue the invention of birth control is one of the most influential and paradigm changing innovations in world history, because fundamentally, more so than anything that's happened in the previous 9,000 years, it's changing the role of women. Birth control transforms sexual practices and it gives women greater control over their reproduction. What's happened with that is, by being able to control reproduction, women are allowed to have their own, have plans, practice sex more often, have careers that they can plan out that don't get interrupted by a pregnancy if that's not something that they choose to have happen. It's transformed the role of women. The 20th century has seen women's rights gain on an exponential level. Women have become a much more important part of workplaces and political systems in a way that we've never talked about before. And at least in part, somewhere between a significant portion and a really big important part of that is birth control and what it allows women to do. If you look at this, this is just U.S. fertility rates since it says 1978. This looks like it goes all the way back to 1960. In 1960, the average American woman was having over 3.5 kids. Now the average American woman is having 1.5 kids. And there's all sorts of interesting implications for what that's doing to changing populations. One of the things that's happening in America is our population is getting older because we're having fewer children. And that's a big, long discussion for another class. If you're in AP Human Geography, you've probably talked about things like this. But this is also going to have a profound effect on overpopulated portions of the world. As a way, places like India and China, which have historically been very patriarchal, as they're starting to adopt birth control as a way of controlling populations, it's slowly but surely leading to increased rights of women in those places too, and also in places like Africa. But as a rule of thumb, fertility rates are dropping. So ask this question. If fertility rates are dropping, why the population grows so much? Yeah, we can feed more people, but if women are having less kids, what's happening? And a lot of that has to also do with medical innovations. One of the things that's happened in the 20th century, this is the first time. Why are there more people in the world in the 20th century? Yes, it's new food, but there's a second thing that goes hand in hand with it, at least as much, and that is new medical technologies that have helped increase the life expectancies of people. In 1850, if you lived in the United States, your life expectancy was about 40 years old. That's fairly typical globally, especially in the Industrial Revolution. If you were a coal miner in Scotland in 1832, your life expectancy was about 30 years old. People die young, especially early in the Industrial Revolution. But as time goes on, one of the things about the 20th century is new medical innovations, such as vaccines and antibiotics. Things that we don't even think about today used to kill people by the thousands 100 years ago. Vaccinations, antibiotics, improved medical technologies like the artificial heart are allowing people to live much, 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 much longer. The global population has gotten much older over the course of the last 100 years. And that's one of the things that has contributed to massive population increases worldwide. Now, if you are an American, you got a 50-50 chance of hitting 80, especially if you're a woman. So this is all part of changing technologies. And we're going to look at some of the, not negatives, but the implications of people living longer in just a moment. Now, one of the sad things about increased interconnections is the spread of global pandemics. The first really big pandemic that hit in the world into the 20th century that's new took place at the end of World War I. In 1917 and 1918, soldiers in World War I on both sides in the trenches started to fall seriously ill to strange disease, and it's called the Spanish flu. It's also called the influenza pandemic of 1918. And soldiers were being laid low by this. Well, then the war ends. And guess what the soldiers do? They go home. American soldiers come back to America. Canadian soldiers go back to Canada. British soldiers go back home to Britain. Indian soldiers go back to India. Australian soldiers go back home to Australia. New Zealanders go back to New Zealand. Africans go back to Africa. What ended up happening was that this disease that starts on the battlefields of World War I ends up spreading globally, and it's devastating. More people die of Spanish flu globally than will die in World War I. The region that lost the most people as a result of this pandemic was India. More Americans die of Spanish flu than soldiers who died in World War I. And you can just see it's a massive pandemic. 5% of the population of India dies because of this. 1% of the American population dies. That's incredible. To give you some context, we've had 500,000 Americans die in the coronavirus pandemic, which is just awful. And I don't want to minimize that, what we're going through right now. I'm going to talk about that some in just a moment. But this would be the equivalent of if 3.5 million Americans had died. That's how many Americans died of Spanish flu in 1918. And it's devastating worldwide. HIV, which was HIV/AIDS, which was a worldwide pandemic that started in the late 1970s and 1980s, ravaged the region America in the 1980s. Early 1990s, there is medicines you can take that control it if you live in a wealthy industrialized region like in the United States. But in Africa, tens and tens and tens of millions of Africans are going to die and suffer from AIDS in the 1980s, 1990s, and early 2000s as a result of this disease pandemic. And now the COVID-19, um, which is another example of globalization. This virus, which certainly seems like started in China, and because of how interconnected the world is, people visited China, people came home, and now it's literally everywhere. And there's very little you can do to stop it. Thankfully, vaccines were created incredibly quickly, and hopefully all this mess is going to be over in a week or a month or so, maybe a couple months. Maybe I'm being a little too optimistic, but hopefully we're all going to get vaccinated very, very, very soon and put this behind us. But this isn't even like anywhere near the worst global pandemic of the 20th century or of period 4. At the very, very most, it's like 6th place. But I did want to talk about it because this is something we're living through and something a little bit more vivid for you to see. Now, as people have lived longer, new people have become vulnerable to new diseases. The first thing we need to know are diseases associated with increased life expectancy. Very few people in world history died of heart attacks or Alzheimer's disease or cancer before period 4. Why? Because they died of a million other things before you would live that long. These are diseases that generally attack older populations. And for most of world history, you just didn't have that many people reach that age limit. But as people have lived longer, you're starting to see more and more widespread heart disease, which leads to heart attacks, Alzheimer's, and cancers in aging populations. The two leading causes of death in America today are heart disease and cancer. And 100 years ago, that just wouldn't have been the case. Also, there are diseases associated with impoverished regions of the world, cholera and malaria. You're like, I've never heard of anyone having cholera or malaria. That's because you live in a rich country. Okay, places like China, India, Africa, these are still ongoing diseases that periodically you see epidemics take place in. And as these countries become wealthier, as they have access to better medicines, these have become less and less problems. But 70s, 80s, 90s, these are still very, very real things in many quote unquote poor regions of the world. Again, it's all part of globalization, is this interconnectedness that's taking place, that's making populations vulnerable to these things. So, big takeaway is that the world's interconnected more than ever before, and the world's just accelerating and becoming more and more interconnected as time continues. We're producing more food, more energy, people are living longer, which means there's more diseases. As people are more interconnected globally, it opens the door for pandemics. That's our big theme for today. We're going to continue the economics of globalization in the next couple of days.